So I've been really craving a Chinese takeaway this week, and this got me thinking, where did the first Chinese takeaway even come from? I mean, you know, apart from China. So Chinese food has been in Britain for a surprisingly long time, providing Brits everywhere with a delicious shortcut to happiness. The first Chinese food that was served in the UK during the 19th century was probably the most authentic, though it would take a long time and several reinventions for it to really catch on with the locals. So today, I'm gonna cook one of these star dishes that really got the Brits hooked on Chinese food, and that dish is sweet and sour pork. But I'm also gonna look at the history of how Chinese food really took the British restaurant scene by storm, and how the phenomenon that was Chinese takeaway was created. So to make sweet and sour pork, first up we need to marinate our meat. To do this, I'm taking about ½ kilo of pork shoulder and cutting it up into nice chunky slices. Then I'm putting my pork slices into a bowl with a teaspoon of sugar, pepper, some light soy sauce, some peanut oil, some Shaoxing wine, some baking soda, some salt, and an egg white. I'm mixing it all together and leaving it in the fridge to marinate for a couple of hours. So going back to Chinese food in Britain, it has a really interesting history. In the mid to late 1800s, cafe owners from Shanghai started popping up in London's Docklands area. These cafes served traditional Chinese dishes like preserved egg and carp, but it was a bit of a culinary step too far for the locals, and the Brits didn't really catch on. And the cafes only really survived thanks to the huge number of Chinese sailors that came into port. But one day, all that changed. In 1908, a former ship's cook named Chung Koon opened London's first Chinese restaurant called Maxim's in Soho. The food was largely Cantonese, inspired by colonial ties to Hong Kong, and the most popular dish on the menu was sweet and sour pork. The food was apparently very different from what Chinese communities typically ate at the time. It lacked broths made from bones or shells. It didn't have many vegetables. It was often overly deep fried. It also lacked authentic ingredients like bamboo shoots or water chestnuts or anything that you could find very easily in a Chinese grocer today. They also sold chop suey, some Cantonese curries, and also chips because apparently we're a nation of children. But either way, Maxim's style of Cantonese food really set the tone for fundamentally what British people think of as Chinese food today. So while your pork is marinating, I'm gonna prep my sweet and sour sauce. So into a bowl goes apple cider vinegar, Shaoxing wine, brown sugar, salt, ketchup, and cornflour. Mix it all together and then set aside for later. I did wonder long and hard about using ketchup in this recipe. Although it's really common to see it in modern interpretations of sweet and sour sauce, it just seemed a little bit wrong trying to use it in recipes from the early 20th century. But I ended up falling down a bit of a ketchup rabbit hole, whatever that is, and it's actually a lot more authentic than I'd appreciated. Even though ketchup is now basically given as tomato sauce, its origins go back to about 300 BC as a fermented fish sauce in China. Then around the 17th century, British sailors in Southeast Asia became obsessed with their newly discovered catsup, and they brought it back to Britain with them. Many British traders made an absolute fortune by selling the fermented fish ketchup back home. And after a while, people started developing their own homespun versions of ketchup to avoid the huge import costs from China. Over time, the recipes started to adapt to a Western palate. That's where you see the umami flavour starting to be replaced with things like mushroom ketchup, before ultimately turning into the sweeter tomato variety that we all know today. Also in the 20th century, China started importing ketchup from the West, and many chefs started experimenting with ketchup as an easier way to make base sauces like sweet and sour pork. So when you're ready to cook your pork, I'm adding some more corn flour into the mix to thicken it up. This also has the benefit of lowering the temperature at which the Maillard reaction occurs, so should hopefully make for some nice crispy pork. Into a heavy casserole dish, I'm pouring in a mixture of vegetable oil and peanut oil to shallow fry our pork. I'm going to do 2 fries for this. The first at about 150–175 degrees for 7–8 minutes. This is where we're cooking the pork through. Break up the pork pieces to make sure they're not sticking to each other, but try not to be too rough in case you dislodge that coating. I probably overcrowded the pan a little bit and it brought down the temperature of my pork, so I had to cook it a little bit longer. Remove the pork from the pan and increase the fry oil heat to about 200 degrees. So how did we get from that first Chinese restaurant to the countless ones we have today? And part of the answer of how Chinese restaurants became so prevalent actually goes back to World War II. It wasn't until after World War II that Chinese food really started to be popular across the whole UK and not just the restaurants in London. So the Docklands area in London's East End, where so many Chinese immigrants had settled in the century before, was really heavily bombed during the Blitz in World War II. The area was just full of factories that made it a prime target for German bombers, and sadly a lot of people living there were either killed or displaced by the bombing. This led a lot of Chinese immigrants to set up new communities, particularly in Soho, where that first Chinese restaurant opened and where you'll find Chinatown today in London. Then after World War II, it took a little while for maritime trade to pick up again, and many Chinese sailors were sacked by their shipping companies. So many decided to enter the growing restaurant trade instead. So how does all of this lead us to the genesis of Chinese takeaway food? And this all started in 1958. John Kuhn, who was the son of Chung Kuhn, the man who opened the first Chinese restaurant in London, he opened his own Chinese restaurant called Lotus House. And it quickly became so popular that people simply couldn't get a table and asked if they could get the food to go home with them. At the start of the 1950s, there were estimated to be about 36 Chinese restaurants across the whole of the UK. 2 decades later, they were opening up at a rate of about 3 each week. And by the 90s, those 36 restaurants had ballooned into about 5,000 Chinese restaurants across the UK. A lot of Chinese families who'd moved to the UK in search of a better life would set up their own Chinese takeaways. They would often live above their businesses, and many took over the sites of old fish and chip shops, which is why today you will still get a lot of fish and chip shops that still offer things like curry sauce or spring rolls, just as that bit of a legacy. Add the pork back in and fry for another couple of minutes. This is where we're going to try and get that lovely crispy coating that will stick with the sauce. And into a separate pan, put a little bit of sesame oil. Take onions, take some spring onions, peppers, and pineapple, which you will forget to actually put in the recipe, and so now it's in the fridge as a snack for tomorrow. And add the vegetables to your pan. Fry off until the vegetables are cooked but still have a little bit of a crunch to them. Then pour in your sauce and keep stirring to let it thicken. Once the sauce is thickened and got nice and glossy, then add your pork back in and mix it all together. Plate it up and enjoy a delicious plate of sweet and sour pork. I am so excited about this one. I did forget the pineapple, but also I don't really like pineapple. I always pick it out, so quids in for forgetfulness. Bottoms up. Yes, yes, yes. This is really hitting all of my cravings right now. I've read a lot of recipes that argue between pork tenderloin or what cut to have. The shoulder is really lovely, it's a bit marbled, and it really lends itself to that shallow fry I did. It's remained so tender from that marinating. The sauce is sticky and sweet. The difficulty I'm really having is that this is delicious, but this is delicious because this is what I've grown up thinking of as Chinese food, and it's probably not the real thing. It's something that's based on other dishes and then embellished to appeal to a Western palate. And this sucker is really lapping it up, let me tell you. I hope this was informative, and I really suggest you give this recipe a try.